May be seated. Shabbat Shalom. So I first heard this story from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner when I was still in rabbinical school, and I actually just did a little math in my head, math not being my strong point. I heard this story 40 years ago. And I've only heard it orally, I've never read it. So I'm probably telling it differently than Rabbi Larry Kushner told it. Larry Kushner, for those of you who don't know, is not Harold Kushner. Although they were often confused for each other because they were both pulpit rabbis in the suburbs of Boston. Okay, but Larry Kushner helped to popularize and make accessible the Jewish mystical tradition for American Jews. And after his retirement, he moved to San Francisco, and he's now quite an accomplished painter. So a talented guy. Anyway, so here's the story. This takes place in Sfat in Israel shortly after 1492, when the Jews were kicked out of Spain, and some of them, because the Ottoman Empire was willing to accept them, and Eretz Israel at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire, so there was a community of Spanish exiles in Sfat, and this guy was one of them. And he used to go to shul, well, they wouldn't have called it shul. He used to go to synagogue every Shabbat. And although he lived in Eretz Israel, he didn't know Hebrew all that well. But beyond that, he would fall asleep in synagogue. Okay, so Stu, you're in good company. It's a well-established tradition. Okay, so he heard this verse from our Parsha. So he fell asleep, he woke up briefly, and he heard this verse from our Parsha. You shall take fine flour and bake it into 12 chalot, using 2/10 of an ephah of flour for each challah. These you shall place in 2 piles, 6 in each pile, on the pure gold table before Adonai. And then he fell asleep again. Okay, so when he woke up, he was convinced that God had spoken directly to him, telling him to bring 12 challahs and give them to God. So he went home and he told his wife, God spoke to me and God wants 12 challahs. Okay, so obviously she couldn't make much Shabbat, right? So on Sunday, she made 12 challahs and he put them in a sack and he brought them to the synagogue. And then he's like, okay, so I'm supposed to give these challahs to God, but how do I do them? Oh, I know. I mean, what is the place in the synagogue that's the closest to God? Right, the Aron Kodesh, the ark, right? So he opens up the ark and he puts the 12 challahs in 2 rows of 6 inside the ark, and he closes the ark and he leaves. Okay, and a few minutes later, the shamus of the synagogue comes in and he starts pouring his heart out to God, and he says, God, I mean, I understand, and this part I really relate to, I understand that the synagogue can't pay me a lot of money, but they're doing the best they can, but it's not really enough, and we're hungry. God, could you please provide for me and my family? And he starts to leave the synagogue. And then for some reason, he gets this inspiration and he goes back into the synagogue and he opens the ark. 12 holidays. So he takes them home, right? And they eat some and they sell the rest, and it supplements the family's income, right? So the next day, our sleeping buddy decides to go into the synagogue and see what happened to the challah, right? So he goes into the synagogue and he opens the ark, and the challahs are gone, right? So he came back and he told God took the challahs, okay? So we have to do this every week, right? And every week he would come in with the 12 challahs and he'd place them in the ark. And a few minutes later, the shamus would come and he'd pray for sustenance, and he'd open the ark and he'd take out the challahs, and then, right, and this went on for several weeks, okay? And then the guy said, God, I'm glad you like the challahs, okay, but I want to tell you, my wife makes the best raisin challahs in all of Eretz Israel. Okay, so the next week, he brings raisin challahs, right? And he puts them in the ark, and the guy comes back the next day. Oh, God, I'm glad. I hope you like the raisin challahs, right? We'll do this from now on, right? And this goes on now for years, right? And, you know, Mrs. Shul Sleeper starting to get a little bit old, right? And, you know, I'm learning that like your appendages, they don't work as well as they used to, right? And so finally one day, the shamus comes, he says, God, you know, I really don't like to complain, okay? Because you're very, very generous to provide for my, but the challahs are getting a little bit long. Right, the challahs getting a little bit low, right? And then finally one day, right, and this has gone on for years, right? The rabbi of the shul happens to be there when the guy comes in with the challahs, and when the shamus comes in and prays, and he, you know, and he's like me, he's very rational. So he said, he got the two of them together and he said, you need to understand that God is not taking these challahs, okay? And then he told the shamus, and you need to understand that God is not bringing you the challahs. And he explained this what happened. And the shamus, like, he starts to cry, right? Because he's thinking, no more challahs, right? And so the rabbi, Kushner told two different versions of this story. I'm going to tell the nice one, right? Now that you know that this is what's happening, you still have to give 12 challahs every week to the shamus, right? Because as Jews, we have a commandment, a mitzvah, to provide for the poor and the needy in our midst. Okay, that's the nice part. I won't tell you the other one, right? But the question is, right, so that rationalistic rabbi said, God is not taking the challahs and God is not giving you the challahs, right? And I want to tell you that as rationalistic and as pure a litvak as I am, that I don't agree with that rabbi, okay? The challahs that the poor man received did in fact come from God, right? Because our task as Jews, right, is to be the hands of God in the world, right? And we have Mishnayot at the beginning of the Siddur, right? I mean, before COVID, I used to read them when nobody else was here, unless Jed was also here, in which case he would read them, right? But you ought to look at them, right? Because there's a Mishnah that says, just as God clothes the naked, you should clothe the naked. Just as God visits the sick, you should visit the sick. And just as God buries the dead, you should bury the dead, right? And then it goes on, because the question is, right? So God does all these things, and the answer in the Torah is, yes, he does, right? When did God clothe the naked? Right, Adam and Eve, when they were hiding in the garden, he made them clothes, right? When did God visit the sick? Right, after Abraham had his bris at age 80, right? And God sends the angels, right, to visit him. So God visited the sick. And when did God bury the dead? The end of the Torah, when Moses dies, right? Moses dies and God buries him, and that's why we don't know to this day where Moses' burial place is, right? And we should imitate God and do these godly things. Do these godly things. And the fact of the matter is, right, people who do these things absolutely feel in their hearts that they are doing Jewish, right? I mean, those of you who participated in the brunch for the men's shelter on December 25th, or, you know, mitzvah day, making meals for the, right? Did you feel like you were doing a Jewish thing then? Right. I mean, at least as much as sitting in shul listening to me drone on and on, right? I mean, that's doing Jewish, right? And you don't have to be traditionally observant to do them, because like I said in the, you know, earlier, right? The Torah is a manual for teaching you how to be a mensch, right? But then people say, okay, so I'm already a mensch, right? Right? I'm already, in other words, right? I do all these things, and they mean it. They mean it, right? They are charitable, right? And they seek peace and pursue it, and they try to make their community a better place. And they eat treif and violate Shabbat and never come to shul, right? So I would say that they're still doing Jewish, right? They understand that they're still doing Jewish, but I would also say that the motivation for Jews to do these things, right, even if they're not personally observant, right, comes from ancestors who were observant, right? I mean, how many times and it's usually Bubby and not Zadie, right? That people remember and they say, my Bubby used to do that, and so that's why I do them, right? Okay, but you know what? God willing, if you're not already, right, one day you're going to be somebody's Bubby and Zadie, right? And what is the example that you're going to set for them, right? And if we don't set this example, that this inheritance of goodness could go away, God forbid. Shabbat Shalom. Yes, Steve.
Put aside for the message I think there's also an incredible, at least for me, an incredible emotional feeling when you're the recipient of somebody doing a kind deed for you, when for no reason and when you least expect it and when you most need it. And I think that that contributes in a sense to the modern expression of pay it, I never get it right, pay it forward or play it forward.
Right, pay it forward.
Because it has such, at least for me, such an emotional impact on me, makes me think twice about paying for, planning for.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me, and I feel this way, right, when people do good things for me, right? Like when Jacob, right, in his fervent nighttime prayer, right, praying to be rescued from Esau, right, he says, Katonti mikol hasadim, right? I am, I don't know how to translate exactly katonti, right? I am too small. I do not deserve all of the good things that you, Hashem, have done for me, right? And the answer, I mean, we don't, right? We don't. I mean, frankly, you know, you come into this world and God hasn't promised you a thing, and God doesn't owe you a thing, right? But the people who fulfill God's promises are our fellow human beings, right? And you know, presumably our fellow Jews, right? And that's why, that's what's known as Kiddush Hashem, as sanctifying God's name. Okay, Shabbat Shalom. And we continue with the Musaf service, the Kaddish before Musaf 155 or 428, and then we'll say the first two pages together through the Kedusha, and then conclude in